on the climate crisis, you do hear people say things like, we need radical innovation, where they mean innovation to zero carbon emissions. You hear people say, I'm really scared. I don't think we're going to make it. You hear these things and you might be comforted by the fact that the people saying them are not only Bill and John, your friends, the environmental activists, but in these cases, Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, who made the first statement, and John Doerr, eminent Silicon Valley venture capitalist, who made the second. This Bill and John might have direct and positive influence on industry and government. In the talk in which he confessed his fear, Doerr traced his awakening to the culminating comment of a friendly dinner conversation about global warming at his home. The speaker was Doerr's daughter, Mary, 15 years of age. I'm scared, she said, and I'm angry. Dad, your generation created this problem. You better fix it. Unfortunately for us, Gates's call for innovation to zero came in 2010. Doerr's statement, I don't think we're going to make it, came in 2007. I don't know whether Mary is still speaking to her father, but I do know that she's now about 30 years old. In 2021, Silicon Valley is not ground zero of the clean tech revolution, but of social media, which is of course frequently used to deny the need for a clean tech revolution. So maybe the private sector won't do the job. What about states? If there's one terrifying crisis you'd assume would force governments finally to get their acts together, it's the climate emergency. Global heating will plainly, if unchecked, make the planet uninhabitable for human beings. You might assume this is one of our easier problems about which to achieve agreement. Nearly everyone on Earth now has direct experience of climate problems, from mega droughts to super hurricanes, just to name two phenomena that are alternately punishing the western and eastern ends of my home country, the United States. In addition, there's no great mystery about the physical mechanisms at work. There's also no mystery about a main solution. Sooner rather than later, we need to end the use of fossil fuels. Nor is there an absence of formally agreed policy goals, the most famous being the Paris Agreement of 2015 to limit global temperature increases to well below 2.0 degrees centigrade, preferably below 1.5, and yet governments very much do not have their acts together. The G7 nations met just this past weekend in Cornwall and failed even to agree to complete financial contributions to poorer countries on which they agreed 11 years ago. No nation in the world is on track to reduce fossil fuel emissions soon enough to keep warming to 1.5 degrees, and the global north is not on track to build and fund cooperative relations with the global south to solve a problem disproportionately created by the north. So Peter Newell is here to tell us why not, and also to help explain how we can move forward. It may feel to many of us that vested interests in interstate power relations always have the means to block the combined weight of climate science and related social disciplines. Professor Newell does analyze the lock-in around production, finance, and the governance of energy for the benefit of the fossil fuel complex. But he also analyzes the counterpower of civil society movements, and these movements in turn both inform and are informed by the kind of scholarly research that Professor Newell assembles in this book. He brings civil society together with the greenhouse chemistry, the geopolitics, the political economy, and the racial and colonial relations that are keeping us stuck, but that can be changed. To stay well under the 2-degree threshold, the package will need to tie defossilization to just transitions for workers, and end to the North's extractive economic relations to the global South, and other factors that he's about to help us integrate into a larger whole. Okay, before turning it over, I'd just like to note a resonance among the books that we've been launching here at the ISRF this past year. In quite different ways, they trace fixing intractable problems in the world to creating new forms of interpersonal sovereignty over governmental powers. Okay, these forms, in turn, require new ideas, which these books are generating. So just to mention a subset of our series so far, in January, in his book, An African Path to Disability Justice, Oche Onazi redefined disability justice through Ubuntu, a relational, not individualist notion of personhood, one that, in Oche's reading, obliges societies to respect asymmetrical capabilities, rather than taking advantage of them. In March, in her book, Being Sure of Each Other, Kimberly Brownlee offered detailed philosophical reasons for why social rights are more fundamental than individual rights, which means we need a deep democratic restructuring of interpersonal relations. In April, Gabor Schering, talking about Hungary, showed how liberal market relations can be turned into authoritarian capitalism and argued for mass vigilance against the strongman creation of an accumulative state. Last month, Craig Jones analyzed the way nations can use the law not to reduce military violence, but to support its everyday operationalization. Although this set of ISRF fellows would, where they all here today, disagree on various things from their diverse disciplines, they are mounting a collective challenge to 19th century Western liberal individualism and to its continuing neoliberal updates that have so far ensured failures of collective action when we now need levels of world cooperation that humans have never yet achieved, but could, with the help of the new models of social life our authors have been working on. And that very much includes Peter Newell. So as Stuart mentioned, we'll hear from Professor Newell first, and then from two particularly interesting experts in the field, Chris Hesketh with us from Oxford, England, and also Haley Stevenson with us from Buenos Aires, Argentina. So I'm going to introduce them each one at a time. So Peter Newell is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex and the author of a large number of articles and books at the intersection of climate, energy, politics, and economics. These include Climate for Change, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2000, Globalization and the Environment, Polity in 2012, and Global Green Politics in 2019. He is active in civil society organizations of the kind he analyzes in his research, serving on the boards of Greenpeace UK and of the Rapid Transition Alliance. So it's a pleasure to have you here, Peter. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that kind introduction. And thanks also to Stuart and Lars for organising the event. And of course, to all of you for joining us today. And to Haley and Chris for taking time out to comment and engage in a discussion of the book and its contents, and no doubt, of course, its limitations. So yes, as Chris has already introduced, the big theme of the book is how can we transition to a zero carbon economy in a timely and fair fashion. And of course, it's one of the greatest challenges the world faces, and there are many competing visions about how to achieve that, some of which Chris alluded to already. So you have Bill Gates in his book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, putting a great deal of emphasis on technological innovation, how to get ideas to market and mobilize private capital. Although he admits coyly and interestingly in the book that I think more like an engineer than a political scientist, and I don't have a solution to the politics of climate change. And you might argue, in fact, I would argue that he's not alone in that. Of course, many of the key thinkers in this debate come from other disciplines, other traditions, other perspectives. Nicholas Stern is one of the most famous contributors to this discussion and described climate change as the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. But over recent years, there has been more attention, luckily, to the question of governance, political power in transition studies, the study of how to transition from one way of doing things to another. And in this case, of course, how to move from a fossil fuel heavy economy to a lower carbon economy. And these are focused on questions of disruption, regime destabilization, how to undo incumbency and the many sites in which that form of incumbency operates in order to move towards a more just energy economy or a just transition. And so what I try and do in this book, building on these lines of work, is argue for the need for a power shift if we are to successfully address this crisis. In other words, it's not for the lack of good technologies or pricing mechanisms that we're facing climate chaos. It's rather the concentration of power in actors and institutions that benefit from unsustainability and over whom we have limited control. So this includes power over production, finance, technology, and institutions, but it also refers to power between and within nations, among social groups, the power of capital over labor, and of the state over citizens. And that essentially without shifts in these things, the technologies may indeed change, the markets might look different, but the roots of the current crisis in the unsustainability of the world's political economy will remain untouched. So we might, in fact, with some of these conventional solutions, get accelerated decarbonisation, but I don't think we'll get it with social justice or deeper forms of sustainability. So the central question I try and address the book is then, how can we make sense of and engage with this pressing question of accelerating transitions to a lower carbon economy using the tools, concepts and ideas within global political economy. And so this implies an analysis both of the political work of assembling actors and social forces that are in favour of and will benefit from a lower carbon economy, but also the more difficult task perhaps of undoing incumbent power organised around the fossil fuel complex, in other words, disassembling the high carbon economy. And theoretically, to try and get a handle on these issues, what I do is combine different strands of politics and international political economy with work on so-called socio-technical transitions. And I do that to try and make sense of four elements of the transition, which is really how the book is structured, around production, around financing, around governance, and around mobilisation. And empirically, it draws on earlier work I've done in sites as diverse as South Africa, India, Argentina, Kenya, and the UK. But it's also informed, as Chris was alluding to my participation and role in the Rapid Transition Alliance, engagements with Greenpeace, work with the local council here where I live, near Brighton, in their responses to the climate emergency and the development of a climate assembly and experiences like that. So it's not just the academic engagement, it's also born of reflections of direct engagements in some of these processes. So how do I try and make sense of this? I talk about a political economy approach. Well, what do I mean here? So there's really four elements I try and develop through the book. One is a more historical analysis. In other words, what precedents and parallels are there? When have things changed? When have we disrupted constellations of power? And how can that inform the debate we're now having? Clearly, there have been shifts in finance, infrastructures, institutions, and there's a live debate in transition studies around the temporality of transitions. How fast can they occur? Over what sort of timeframes? What are the forces that drive those sorts of things? But I also try and go back even further and look at the prehistories of transition. And that's, as Chris was suggesting, relates to these longer and deeper and obviously very problematic processes of extraction and colonialism and the extraction of what's called cheap energy, as Patel and Moore would refer to it. In other words, transitions in Europe and elsewhere and richer parts of the world are often prefigured and contingent upon ongoing forms of extraction and disruption elsewhere. So there's a strong historical element. The second pillar is a more political analysis, asking transition to what and on whose terms. And for me, this requires a fuller account of the state and particularly its relationship to capital. So not just emphasising policy and governance elements, which are increasingly covered in different literatures, but some of those bigger questions of power and agency and structure. Because it's that terrain, if you like, of struggle that structures the possibilities of change going forward. And of course, there's a strong ideological element there, what transition scholars might refer to as landscape factors, which bear down on the ways in which different countries are trying to deal with these issues and affects their capacity to address them. Strong preferences for privatisation or power sector reform in some parts of the world, for example, which impact on our ability to adequately deal with some of these issues. So that's the second element. The third is a more global analysis. Clearly, transitions are organised across space and time. Costs and opportunities are globally distributed and externalised, raising questions of energy justice. There are geographies of transition. I talk a lot, drawing on Harvey's work, of course, about the spatial and temporal fixes that are employed to try and displace responsibility onto poorer groups elsewhere and to protect incumbent power. And then the final element is an ecological element. And I draw on ecological political economy and political ecology, because all of these issues of transition and how they're organised and how the costs and benefits are dispersed and captured raise questions of access and allocation and property rights and justice. And those analytical traditions are very useful in trying to get a handle on those sorts of things, because natures are always reordered through these processes. And so it goes beyond the narrow question of socio-technical configuration and forces us to think, what would it look like to ecologize production and finance and governance if we were to take ecology more seriously and view things in relation to one another rather than isolated systems. So very briefly then, the key arguments, the sort of four elements of this, one is around growth. And basically, I tried to argue that climate change represents, amongst other things, a legitimacy crisis for contemporary global capitalism, though not just global capitalism. I pitch it more broadly in terms of industrialism, a point to which we can return later on, perhaps. So energy transitions in this reading are just one site in a broader site of struggle, and both in intended and unintended ways, climate change draws attention to and highlights or amplifies, if you like, a series of tensions and contradictions that inhere in this project of industrialism. And this is really firstly visible in the inability to maintain required levels of capitalist growth while safeguarding a climate system fit for human existence. Some of the analysis coming out of OECD and other bodies shows how difficult it's going to be to square halting warming at 2 or even 3 degrees warming with conventional levels of growth. And tellingly, it was only in the wake of the financial crisis that in May 2009, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, reported that global demand for electricity was expected to fall. So of course, there are sites of decarbonisation. There is some delinking, and many studies have shown this, in specific sectors at specific moments of time. But Jevons paradox, in other words, the ways in which resource savings often get reinvested elsewhere, boosting consumption overall, mean that these incremental gains are often outweighed. So that's the first step of the argument around growth. The second step of the argument is around labour. And these contradictions are manifest in a system through wage labour and the welfare of, ties the welfare of workers to an unsustainable project. And of course, this locks in, it bakes in resistance to systemic change. And so whilst, you know, more transformative responses to climate change might offer the longer term prospect of increasing social justice and environmental sustainability, in the short term, it pits a powerful and wide-ranging incumbency complex against a viable future for humankind. And I think we see this in debates about just transitions and the role that some trade unions or AstroTurf organisations have played in pushing against international agreements, pushing against carbon taxes, pushing against many more ambitious domestic policies. The ironic effect, of course, of all of this is to commit us to a warming world in which the livelihoods of the poorest and most marginal will be most exposed. And then the third element of the argument is around global inequality, because these contradictions are further magnified by the need to reverse centuries of extraction and exploitation by elites in the global north, with ample collaboration with elites from the global south, of course. So the expansion of economic activity in parts of the world afflicted by global poverty, extreme poverty, has to be accommodated by corresponding cuts in production in the global north. So in a world economy characterized by uneven development and patterns of systemic exploitation of periphery countries by the core, this represents a full frontal threat to capitalism as we know it, because it implies a more just allocation of responsibility for action going forward if we're to properly acknowledge historical carbon debts and the need for compensation for poorer countries. And so this global politics of uneven exchange are deeply woven in to the politics of energy transitions. But rather than address them, a lot of the discussion at the moment is around the use of these spatial or temporal fixes, going for forest projects or carbon trading or geoengineering, these seemingly attractive fixes which delay having to confront and address some of these problems, so that the problems get moved around rather than dealt with. And of course, this isn't just about interstate conflict, it's about conflicts within states, social conflicts around who and what energy is for. And then the final part of the argument is around accommodation. So to see off the increasingly evident need for transformations in which energy is at the heart because of its relationship to growth, states and many corporations have been engaged in a project of what Gramsci referred to as transformismo, which is about accommodating the threat posed by climate change, as I apply it here, to the legitimacy of economic and political systems. And so the governance systems set up have to try and manage and deal and deflect some of these criticisms and contradictions. And that's why I use the concepts in this way. So rather than address the need for reduced consumption or shifts in production, redistribution, the emphasis is much more on more technology, more finance, more markets, better pricing, more enforceable property rights, etc., in order to enable a new round of accumulation. So just to wrap up then, clearly energy systems are always in flux and are being reconfigured as the links between production, finance, and governance and mobilisation challenge them and move them in different directions. My argument, though, overall, as I've emphasised, is the need for a power shift, that we need greater social and democratic control over the ownership, direction, regulation, production and consumption of energy, and to wrest it away from incumbent hands. Otherwise, technologies may change, systems of transmission and distribution may be altered, but if the purposes of energy policy and the assumptions about whose energy needs take priority and who pays the social and environmental costs of energy pathways are not up for discussion and contestation, the prospects of a more meaningful, just transition remain very remote indeed. So none of this bolder vision does away with the need for shorter term engagements, contesting assumptions, resisting individual projects and investments. There's always going to be messy compromise, coalition building, learning by doing. None of this is singular or fixed in any way, but I do think we also need to keep in mind this bolder vision of a relationship between energy and society that we see in moves around the world, not in broader counter movements necessarily, but in these moves in the way Polanyi would talk about it, that show the possibility and of course the pressing need for a more sustainable and just energy order. And with that, I'll stop.
We are now going to have our two commentators. The first is Chris Hesketh, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at Oxford Brookes University, where he researches the geographical development of capitalism, states, class, and neocolonial formations in Latin America as well as elsewhere, and as well as indigenous resistance to neoliberalism, in part through the formation of counter spaces. Because I tried to get your whole mover into one sentence. He is the author of Spaces of Capital, Spaces of Resistance, which is a book on Mexico and global political economy, came out with the University of Georgia Press in 2017. He's also the author of many articles that range from the social function of football development in China to the survival of non-capitalism, possibly in many places. Chris, over to you. Thanks for being here.
First of all, I would like to congratulate Peter on producing an excellent and timely book that responds to the urgent question of the present. How do we rapidly decarbonize our economy? As he rightly says, this is among the most vital questions humanity currently faces. And the book sets out the stark challenges that we are up against, namely changes to complex social systems in all aspects of production and consumption that are necessary to ensure planetary survival. In the present, it often still does feel like we are sleepwalking to disaster. An analogy for our environmental predicament that I have seen used is of a car driving towards the edge of a cliff. But rather than applying brakes, we simply hope that the car will magically sprout wings. This analogy seems to me to be the epitome of current market-based solutions to the environmental crisis that refuse to name the elephant in the room, which is, in my view, capitalist production. It's also telling to observe that some of the longest entries in this book's index are respectively capital, capitalism, energy, and production. The book, therefore, doesn't shy away from clearly stating that the dilemma that humanity is facing is inextricably bound up with our current mode of production, based on unsustainable patterns of growth and consumption. However, other critically oriented books have highlighted similar such problems with capitalism and the pursuit of infinite growth in a finite world. So what is it that sets this book apart and makes it different? For me, what sets it apart is its sustained focus on alternatives. There is quite frequently, in my view, a rather unfortunate tendency on what we could broadly call the left to focus largely on the role and the dynamics of capital when we explore the present. Perhaps inspired by Marx's famous quotation that he didn't write recipes for the cook shops of the future, this often means that little attention is devoted to exploring possibilities of change. The difficult task of thinking about how change comes about is either left to the conclusion of a work or to sloganeering and posturing that aligns concrete engagement with a range of current possibilities. However, while be realistic, demand the impossible might be a brilliant slogan, it misses the key point that action and strategy consist in making what is possible tomorrow what was deemed impossible today. In this book, I think Peter expertly navigates this dilemma. He states clearly that it's not his task to provide blueprints or a singular vision for change. Instead, what is undertaken is a thorough and sober analysis of the challenges we face, the different possibilities that abound, and the powers that will need to be confronted to achieve the rapid energy transitions necessary. The various chapters in the book enlighten us to historical and contemporary examples of rapid transitions and the means needed to get us there. But there is at the same time a realism about the way in which efforts remain blocked and subverted by incumbent forms of power. It's around that latter issue that I want to make my own brief interventions by way of posing some issues and questions back to Peter. To be absolutely clear, I don't expect any book to be able to cover all and every issue. So these that I raise now, in many ways, are natural extensions and discussion topics of the sort that I hope this book will provoke from all that read it. So my questions emerge from the Gramscian understanding that's used in this book to probe a little bit further what the politics of rapid energy transitions might be. This is particularly important given the concern throughout the book, not just for a transition, but for a just transition. So what I want to do is to focus on the Gramscian trinity of the 3 C's, namely crisis, consent, and coercion. So let me start with crisis. Many people now recognize the profound crisis that we've been living through, connecting the financial crisis and the ecological crisis to that of our patterns of production and consumption. Peter's example in the book also indicates the importance of crises for moments of inspiration and leverage. Both the COVID pandemic and the financial crises are cited as examples of this. However, both to me seem quite instructive of a possible danger too. In the case of COVID, for example, it clearly opened major possibilities, from the grounding of aviation to taking cars off the road to rethinking family and work-life balance as many of us engaged in homeschooling, or also fundamentally rethinking both what and who we valued in our society. However, beyond some saccharine internet videos shared on Facebook, there has been the creep back to business as usual. Meanwhile, the power of the state over our lives has worryingly expanded. This raises 2 concrete questions about crises. First, will the current crisis have to worsen in order to gain traction for the energy transitions that are needed? I think here of Kim Stanley Robinson's recent novel, The Ministry of the Future. Here it required a devastating event, in this case, a major heatwave killing millions, to galvanize people into action. Is this fiction more likely than reality? Secondly, is there a need for civil society to do more to generate crises in the first place, discursively speaking? In other words, proactively creating crises as opposed to reacting to them. The second issue I want to raise is about consent, or the politics of hegemony. Running throughout the book, you focus on Gramsci's notion of transformismo. You rightly highlight the danger of how radical proposals are co-opted and domesticated, or what Gramsci sometimes in a fuller sense called passive revolutions, whereby limited demands are absorbed to prevent more radical or thoroughgoing change taking place. How then can transformismo become genuine transformation? Or, phrased differently, how do we prevent radical demands being absorbed and displaced? For Gramsci, the answer lay in constructing a strong subaltern hegemony. I think an urgent question to pose is when and where the subaltern hegemony could emerge to challenge the dominant global order. And Gramsci, of course, spent some time thinking about the necessary alliances between urban and rural social groups, and in his case, between the north and south of Italy. in his Some Aspects of the Southern Question. We would obviously need to transfer that to look at the global North and the global South, but the fundamental issues remain quite similar. And these are the alliances right now actually being formed? Is the ideological work necessary for transition being done to move from common sense to good sense that we need to save the planet? Where are the organic intellectuals needed for this new hegemonic project? Finally, this brings me to the issue of coercion. Coercion is not necessarily an element that the book dwells on, but Gramsci was pretty clear that some elements of coercion will always exist in a hegemonic project. The book starkly reveals that just 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and that the big 5 oil companies have spent $200 million each year lobbying against climate change or in greenwash projects. Based on this, I'm tempted to recall the words of an activist poster that I once saw, which read as follows: "The earth isn't dying, it is being killed, and those that are killing it have names and addresses." A major theme in recent work, for example, by Andreas Malm, is to focus on the legitimacy of violence, or better, the counter-violence from below, for dealing with the everyday environmental violence of the present. Given that the world's billionaires seem more focused on colonizing other planets than helping to decolonize our own, the need for an open discussion on the role of coercion does seem pressing. Currently, the right to make private profit is pitched against the right to sustainable life for many others in the world. But as Marx once said, between equal rights, force decides. What role is there for coercion in any just transition? These are questions and issues for further comradely discussion, but don't detract at all from what I think is a wonderful book, alive to the radical possibilities of the future, yet aware of the obstacles that prevent us from getting there. Terry Eagleton once said of realists and utopians, "It is the hard-nosed pragmatists who behave as if the World Bank and Cafe Latte will be with us for the next 2 millennia who are the real dreamers, and those who are open to the as yet unfigurable future who are the true realists." With this book, Peter has not tried to give us a single blueprint for the future, but he's certainly helped inspire realistic thinking for how it might be possible. It richly therefore deserves all the praise that will surely come its way. Thanks very much.
Haley Stevenson is our next respondent. She is an associate professor of international relations at the Universidad Torquato di Tella in Buenos Aires. She is the author or co-author of 5 books on various aspects of governance and the environment, including Democratizing Global Climate Governance, out from Cambridge University Press in 2014, and Deliberative Global Governance, which is a great idea, which came out also with Cambridge in 2019. One of the prospects that her work opens up appears in the title of one of her many articles, which is called The Wisdom of the Many in Global Governance. Haley, many thanks for being here all the way from Buenos Aires.
Many thanks indeed, and it's a real pleasure to be here to talk about what is an extraordinary book. Genuinely the best book that I've read in years. So congratulations, Peter. So I want to talk about the multiple contributions that this book makes to our conversations, but also to the way we think about being an academic. In many conversations with many different academics, people who work on sustainability over the years, it's become clear to me that we all have moments, perhaps recurring moments, of existential crisis that, about questioning the role and value of being an academic in contributing to transform unsustainable societies. And the day-to-day work of academia and the perverse incentive structures of the academic industry often seem so unhelpful. And I think future generations, when they look back, will wonder about the contributions of academics and all the things that we publish. In the 1930s, a great Argentine writer, Roberto wrote an essay called The Uselessness of Books. With all the books that are published every year, he said, if every one of those contained just one single new truth, then humanity would have reached an incalculable level of moral civilization. But we haven't. For Alt, the persistence of war and militarization was evidence of that. And he said that most authors keep writing books because it's their job to do so, just in the same way as the job of a builder is to build a house, but at least in the end, the house serves a function. So Alt said that if you want to understand the world, don't just read books. You have to live it. You have to live the world. Think, analyze, work, be sincere with yourself and be sincere with others. Now, I often have this essay by this Argentine writer in my mind when I'm reading academic work, and I think in a world that is awash with words, books, articles, blogs, tweets, I think Peter has written a book that is genuinely valuable, and I think he's done so precisely because he's not an academic that hides amongst books. He actively lives the challenge of transforming unsustainability. And this book integrates insights from his own research over many years, but also from his experience as an activist, a campaigner, and a consultant. And the result is very rich because of that combination. Now, on the academic front, Peter has done us an enormous favor in reading a really vast literature across multiple disciplines and distilling the insights that they can offer for this enormous challenge that we face. And one of the great accomplishments of Peter's book is it offers this multiple perspectives, social, political, economic, historical, and ecological analyses of system transformation by bringing together the different parts of wisdom that have been accumulated across these different fields that are usually not in conversation with one another, that tend to talk past one another, and that, as he shows, tend to be very ahistorical and heavily Eurocentric, and therefore underappreciate how the challenge is very different from the global south, where state capacity is very different, and the relationship between state and market tends to look very different to northern norms. So his book corrects that parochialism. I've always been inspired by another writer's phrase, Max Weber's phrase, that he said, "I'm not a donkey and I don't have a field." Weber was a sociologist, but he refused to be limited just to sociology. He wrote in other disciplines, in the journals of other fields. And for me, Peter is one of the very best contemporary scholars who really embodies this attitude. He doesn't have a field. He works across political economy, international relations, sociology, technology studies, and many more. And one of the contributions of this book is, I think, to inspire early career researchers to move beyond just a very narrow specific field and look at what others are saying in other fields. Now, the book captures the complexity of energy transitions, and in particular, the complexity of transitions in a global context. The book shows how multiple elements are interrelated to produce unsustainable energy systems and therefore unsustainable societies, and how these interrelationships will somehow need to be understood to therefore undo unsustainability. He shows how unsustainability has been produced through interactions between the areas of production, finance, technology, the state and civil society, and how new interactions will need to be produced by opening up and democratizing debates about how energy is generated, by whom, for whom, where, and for what. And given how fundamental energy is to our societies, these are ultimately debates about how we want to organize our societies, and they bring into question really deeply ingrained assumptions about progress and prosperity, which by taking this global context, we can see how those ingrained assumptions about progress and prosperity have only been plausible in the past because they transfer the costs to the future and to vulnerable people in the present. So by confronting these questions, we necessarily kind of avoid the parochialism about debates about energy transitions. If we ignore any one of those questions, the how, by whom, for what, and where, we run the risk of pursuing unjust or untenable paths. And what Peter's book shows is that there is a real tension between urgency and justice. This presents a real dilemma, because the quickest and the easiest options will usually be those that impose a cost on the most vulnerable, and sometimes those vulnerable people will be able to find a voice. We've seen that with the yellow vest protests in France, but often these vulnerable people are far too distant from the centres of power to make their voices heard. And he shows in multiple cases about how the distance between centres of power and vulnerability, and that's not just about about the fossil fuel, the extraction of fossil fuels, but also in lithium mining areas in South America, in the Chilean Atacama Desert, for example. In one of the last chapters in the book about resistance and activism, he shows that there has been some success in changing ideas of what counts as legitimate and illegitimate conduct by investors and by development agencies, but there's a lot more work to be done. And one of the emphases of that chapter is the importance of alliances between across sectors, alliances among indigenous people, women, labour, health, human rights activists, etc. So I want to close my comments with a brief reflection on this type of alliance building and organisation. It's a reflection that brings me back to where I started, the academic vocation and the organisation of the academic industry that, among other things, forces us into fields like Max Weber's donkeys. Cross-sectoral alliances are so difficult because we're so used to working in silos. And this starts in the university, where interdisciplinary training is very rare. And it then translates into our governance systems. At the national level, we have ministries for health, for transport, finance, mining, etc. But there's little interaction between them. At the international level, we then see a World Trade Organization, a World Health Organization, a Council for Human Rights, with little or no interaction between them. And even when we do have these multi-sector organizations like the World Bank or the United Nations Development Programme, they really struggle to move beyond silos within their organizations. They struggle to work in an integrated way. So moving beyond silos and genuinely embracing complexity theory and complexity thinking rather is going to be really important to build momentum for sustainable energy transformations. So one thing, I guess, I wanted to on that note close by acknowledging the Independent Social Research Foundation, which is hosting this webinar, and also hosted Peter for a part of his research for this book. So really hats off to you for promoting this kind of interdisciplinary research in social sciences.
Peter, a quick response from you back to both Chris and Haley, and then we will turn it over relatively rapidly to the audience. Please send your questions into the Q&A and we will port them from there to the panel. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for such positive and generous feedback. It's very welcome. Let me just briefly pick up on a few of the points. I mean, Chris raised a number of issues about does the crisis have to worsen for us to get to a sort of a new stage of transition? Yeah, I guess it depends who the crisis hits. People often thought when we had Hurricane Katrina or when we've seen floods or fires in California that this finally would be the trigger to wake elites up and make them realize that they needed to change things and bring about change. Of course, what it often does, firstly, those crises often hit poorer people most seriously, and they have the least resources to respond. But what you often get are various forms of disaster capitalism as well, right? So you get the vultures moving in, trying to make gain from this in various ways. And we've seen this over many years, and you see it around the financialization of responses to climate change. So far we've talked a lot about adaptation, but if you think about mitigation, but if you think on the adaptation side, the rise of weather derivatives, catastrophe bonds, getting poorer farmers to use crop insurance against the threats of climate change, even though they've contributed very little to the problem in the first place. So for every negative impact of climate change, there are elites and profiteers that are there in the front lines trying to make money for it. So I don't think more and more crises like that will necessarily bring about the sorts of change we want to see. And it comes back to the issue Hayley touched on a little bit, some of the tensions around equity and urgency, that sometimes in those moments of crisis, elites can consolidate control and use coercion, which is obviously another theme that Chris focused on there. And I'm just reading actually Andreas Malm's book about how to blow up a pipeline, and it is very interesting. I think he caricatures a little bit some of the sort of those movements that place the emphasis on non-violent approaches. On the other hand, I think there is a role for sabotage, and I think there is a difference in terms of labelling those strategies violent when it's disruption and damage to property. It doesn't, in my book, constitute violence in quite the same way. And of course, these are the sorts of strategies of resistance or foot dragging, weapons of the weak that we've seen over centuries, really, that poorer groups have always had to adopt. It always has to be blockades, disarming machinery, putting their lives in the front line, the environmental defenders that we have around the world. So for those groups, there's nothing new about this. So the people who live on the front lines of the fossil fuel economy have always had to consider those sorts of strategies. But the way he documents it in Sweden and elsewhere, the rise of activism against SUV cars and things like that is interesting. And I understand the frustration that's building towards around the lack of response and the protection of privilege, really, is what's going on there. So yeah, I mean, the other element I tried to draw in the book, and which we've not mentioned so far around coercion, is the militarism and the role of the military, which is clearly a key part of this story. Militaries are trying to invent a role for themselves in responding to climate crisis, in policing borders against flows of migration triggered by climate change and a whole range of other things. And of course, the actual carbon bootprint, as it's called, of the military is huge. So that's another important part of the story, and that when we're thinking about different dimensions of state power and their role in energy transitions and transformations, we absolutely need to think about the role of military. So that's partly touches on your theme of coercion. Yeah, moving beyond from transformism to transformation, I mean, clearly that's, in a way, that's what the whole book is struggling with. And some of the key things are around how you reframe conversations and question assumptions, such as the fact, we, rather than cut back emissions in this part of the world, a more rational and cost-effective way is to set up offsetting projects elsewhere in the world. Or that in order to carry on, for oil company Shell, for example, saying that they need to carry on extracting oil over the next couple of decades, and in order to do that and offset the emissions associated with that, they're going to buy up an area of land the size of Brazil. So the idea that this is a rational, cost-effective, nature-based solution, some of these basic things need really sort of contesting. But for me, the really hard thing is moving it beyond the questions of technology and pricing and incremental reform to have discussions around work and consumption and those sorts of things. And that's really, really hard. The questions around limits, because we're always sold the notion that there are no limits, technology and other things can always surpass those limits. And yet it's very clear with finite carbon budgets that there are limits, they're just not being respected. And, richer groups and richer nations are clearly massively overusing their share of those carbon budgets. And so bringing the conversation back to those things, getting beyond this fantasy world of, endless growth and being able to push up against these limits without consequences is a really hard thing to do. But in a day-to-day way, I think a lot of us are trying to do it by emphasising the co-benefits of action on climate change. Climate change is often not the key starting point. It can just be about working less, having breathable air, sustainable food economies, control over your own energy, these sorts of conversations which are, driven by what one author referred to as now-topians. So we're doing it in the here and the now. We're trying to live the sort of world we would like to see. And in doing that, we're pushing back against some of these assumptions. So it's not waiting for a big transformational moment, which is sometimes the preferred strategy on the left, but it's bringing these things into being now, hoping that they get picked up, they get scaled, and they pose questions about what is normal. And I mean, I quite liked Rob Hopkins' book. One of the founders of the transition town movement talks about how do we move from what is to what if. Keep posing those what if questions. What if we worked differently? What if we lived differently? What if we built things differently? What if we produced energy in more democratic or decentralized ways? Just posing the questions, pushing back on conventional common sense, I guess, coming back to your point. So I'll probably stop there. There's much more I could say, but I want to take questions from others. Is that enough for now, Chris, or you want me to keep going?
No, that's great, Peter. Let's get to the questions, and we're going to come back to some of these issues. There's a really great mix of stuff here. And Haley, I want to thank you for bringing that Weber quote. And I've read a lot of Weber, but I've never seen that. You're quite good at these quotes. Thanks. That explains a lot about my job that I've had for a long time. Okay, the first question is from Mark Charlesworth, which is to Peter. Given the power of the Jevons paradox, or the rebound effect, that is, as energy efficiency rises, energy consumption also rises. Why do you not consider ways to address that issue? Why not address that essentially moral question by advocating the virtue of moderation or other approaches, and considering how these might be more widely and better practiced? Such a perspective might also point to existing sources of counter-hegemony. That's question one.
Okay, are we taking these one at a time, or you want to cluster them, or what do you want to do?
No, why don't you tackle that, which I think you've already started on, and we'll move on from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is quite a lot of consideration of that. I mean, that's one of the key issues I look at in the book, that very problem of some of the savings that have been made through various energy technology and innovations are being systematically undone by growth elsewhere or consumption in other parts of the economy. So that is an issue I talk about, and it's basically coming back to the conversation we were having just now, really. How do you socialize the idea of limits and sufficiency? And what does that mean? And, to take another example, this happened after the book was written, but we produced a report recently on scaling behaviour change. And really that's what it was asked. It was pushing the need to restrain the behaviours of elites. We talked about the polluter elite in that report. And there are different dimensions of their power. One is around the sort of lifestyle emissions, which we've been alluding to a little bit. And this Dario Kenna, a colleague of mine, has written a fantastic book on this, on carbon inequality. So one is the lifestyle emissions, just the yachts, the big houses, the SUVs, the frequent flying and all of that. A second is the financial power, how richer people invest their money in stocks and shares in fossil fuel companies and so on. And the third is the political pillar of that, which is political influence, party donations, access to committees, that type of thing. And we need to push back on all of those things. And that does invite a conversation about constraints and limits. It might be carbon budgets, it might be rationing, it might be frequent flyer taxes, a whole range of things there which are explicitly trying to address that problem. For the bulk of the population, it's really about enabling more positive change, is what we argue there. It is about recognizing we don't have a lot of active control or agency over things like how our houses are heated or how we get to work. These are about infrastructures of choice, which governments and others have to provide. But for the elites, the 1%, there does have to be some restraints. It might be around limits on income, it might be other things, but there has to be an element of redistribution. There has to be an element of recognizing limits. So very much this idea of sufficiency and the limits of just going for efficiency within a growth-based economy, that's very much in the book.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Next one of a batch of 4 from Thomas Smith. With the this one's kind of a killer too. I say that as a fan of electric cars. With the rapid increase in electric vehicles and with the enormous demand for electricity needed to power them, are EVs part of the answer to climate change if carbon cost is transferred to power producers that are in the hands of a few powerful businesses, oligarchs, etc.? Yeah, good question.
So yeah, are EVs part of the solution? They're part of the solution of moving us beyond fossil fuels, but they do create other challenges and problems. And so a little bit it picks up on this previous conversation about the need to think about reducing energy in the first place or rethink mobility. So it's really a question of, can we think about more public transport? Can we think about pedestrianisation? Some more collective ways of getting about, which reduce and push back on auto mobility, as Matt Patterson and Stefan Bowman people would put it. You know, that's the question, the sort of the very notion that households in richer countries at least should have 1 or 2 cars, and that our cities and infrastructures are designed in that way, is deeply problematic. That's what we have to be pushing back on, sort of reclaiming some of those spaces, because it's not a solution just to say that everyone who currently has a couple of petrol-based cars will now have a couple of electric cars. So when we published that behaviour change report, that was some of the pushbacks. So, oh, it's great, SUV drivers will just get an electric SUV. Well, that's a lot of electricity that will be required to charge up a huge SUV. And the question is, how is that electricity generated? And Hayley mentioned this in her comments. If you think about the lithium triangle in Latin America, there are these rushes on rare earth minerals, cobalt, the lithium, and so on, that's required for battery technologies. So just plugging in a different technology but all else stays the same is not the solution. It does require us to think more intelligently about urban planning and how we meet basic needs, rather than just going electric. So Abigail Martin, a colleague of mine at Sussex, she and I wrote about this in terms of what we called a plug and play approach, that everything else stays the same. You just plug in a different set of energy sources or technologies and assume that you've got a solution. And we argue that that's not the way to do it. So yes, I have an electric vehicle. I think it's a good step in the right direction in terms of moving away from fossil fuels, but it doesn't do away with the need to rethink transport and mobility precisely for those reasons, because if some of those big actors are still the incumbent actors, it's hard. Basically, if you want a throwaway line, it's hard to have clean energy in a dirty economy. The supply chains will still be dirty. They will still be using cheap labour. There will be indigenous people driven off their land. So if the extractivist mentality and way of doing things persists, then the electric revolution will be dirty as well. But we need to get off fossil fuels. So that these things are, it's going to be a messy process of trying to bring different transitions into being at the same time. But it does require us to push back on saying we've got this fixed because we've got electric cars. We haven't. We need to rethink things in a far more fundamental way.
Yeah, Peter, I want to jump ahead. I am going to come back to the previous questions, but push on this point a little bit with a question about carbon budgets from Neil McCullough, because I think it's connected to what you're just saying about cars. How might you operationalize limits on carbon use? Can you think of any politically feasible pathways through which such limits might actually be put into place? And I mean, I would, step up the militancy with this and say, how can you get people, here's your carbon budget, you have no carbon credit card, you have to live with this, and it would be adjusted for perhaps for historical carbon use. So a place like the US or Britain, which, where it goes back to the 1700s, you would actually have a lower per capita budget than countries that weren't dumping CO2 into the energy, in 1819. What do we do about that?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, we already have carbon budgets, right? I mean, that's partly what the Paris Agreement is and other agreements are trying to do. It's either explicit or implicit that there is a limit, and that budget has to be distributed fairly. Clearly, at the moment, that's not being done adequately. And there are other proposals at the global level around contraction and convergence or greenhouse development rights frameworks, which try to allocate carbon budgets in fairer ways. Taking it down to the national level, yes, there could be things, as you're alluding to, Chris, there, personal carbon allowances. The problem slightly with those things for me, though, is that it pushes the problem onto individuals and consumers. And often people have limited agency to make choices to switch energy options or transport options very easily. It may help to restrain overconsumption on the part of richer groups, and there may be some benefit in that. But for me, ultimately, keeping to those budgets is not necessarily just through market mechanisms, it's partly through regulation. So we need production limits. So which is one of the issues I touched on in the book. And there are moves now for more supply side policies on climate change, right? So we normally talk about the consumption side of it and where the emissions are emitted, but there's more and more moves now, and partly this advocacy I've been involved with around a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is about saying clearly manifestly we need to leave large swathes of remaining fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to do that in a fair way. So it's about putting down production limits, and that will then send very strong signals through the market about what's feasible. It is about government regulation. Why are we allowing new models of SUVs to come to market, which are gas guzzling and assuming more things? Why can't we ban private jets? Why do we allow things to come to? It's basically, once you've locked in those emissions or you create behaviours around them, it's really hard to roll back on those things because people get used to them. It's the sense in which things are being taken away. If governments had the guts and the courage of their convictions to do these things, you would stop some of these things coming to market in the first place. There'd be much more stringent set of criteria about innovation and technology and the sorts of things that we want to see in society and who they impact. You know, that's the other thing, is trying to bring in this global element, which I emphasised in the book. So we do have carbon budgets, and of course, like in the UK, we have a climate change committee which sets carbon budgets and is meant to hold the government to account in how they deal with those things. The question is, you know, what are the policies that are most useful in trying to address those things? I'm trying to push the envelope and say there's a whole range of things that we should be considering there, not just a different set of technologies that get plugged in or a different set of pricing mechanisms. There's some more fundamental things around work and consumption and growth and all those other things that have to be part of the picture. But it's much easier to avoid lock-in in the first place than to roll it back once these things are out there. So I think I'd approach it a little bit more that way, rather than just say, okay, all of these things are given and now we're going to put pressure on consumers to consume less. Let's not build the fossil fuel infrastructures in the first place. Let's shift the incentives so that these things don't even come to the fore in the first place, I think. So that's a slightly different way of coming at that question of budgets. The budgets are there. That's not, I don't think that's the problem. It's a question of how we enforce them more effectively.
Great, thanks, Peter. Back to an earlier question from Lee Towers. Maurizio Lazzarato called our society a debt society, and David Graeber has written also on the subject of debt, the first 5,000 years. Thinking of Robinson's novels, what role is there for turning debt around as a resistance tech?
Well, I'm not sure I totally understand the question. So debt as a resistance tech. I mean, debt-fueled consumption is a key part of the problem. It goes back to all the things we were just talking about, right? Encouraging massive record levels of personal indebtedness as people are, trying to acquire more and more things. And actually, that brings me again around to this question of what are the drivers of this, rather than just looking at the symptoms of it. There's a big push at the moment around advertising, regulating fossil fuel advertising. And we've done some work recently through the Rapid Transition Alliance trying to target the sports sector, for example, given, as you may have been, if you've been watching the Euros at the moment, you see the Gazprom adverts coming up everywhere. And as we know, if you watch Premier League regularly, there's sort of, Emirates Airways and stuff like that sponsoring our sport. So there's this sort of normalization of high consumption living and so on. And the selling of more and more products which lock people into debts of various sorts. So I think advertising is an important part of the problem. And debts more broadly, I guess, we've had a history of debt for nature swaps, trying to write off countries' debts in favour in order to, in exchange for commitments to protect forests and so on. Some of the payments for ecosystem services approaches, Hayley knows more about this than me, take that as a point of departure, explicitly linking debts and attempts to try and address some of these issues, because deforestation is obviously one of the key drivers of climate change as well. So the debt question appears in different ways. I don't know if that's what the questioner was trying to get at, but that would be my take on how debt features in this debate. I don't know if Hayley or anyone else wants to say more on that.
Yeah, I think just we've known for several decades now that much of the fossil fuel extraction is driven by debt repayments, by the need for developing countries to repay debts. And we see this now in Argentina with massive debt owed to the IMF, and that the only way to really generate the capital to repay that is through intensifying fossil fuel extraction. So that's another one of the the great things about this book is that it also provides this kind of this geopolitical dimension. So when we think about debt, it's not just individual debt; it's how international institutions entrench, entrench debt in the international system, and how we can pursue sustainability when we have such powerful international economic institutions that work in ways that are completely opposed to those goals.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Very complex. All right, for your next book, Peter. Here is one from Irma Allen. Could you speak to the challenges of trying to act to prevent the worst effects of climate change, implement sustainability and just transition, while navigating the risks posed by this political context that we're increasingly familiar with, which is a right-wing populism, which tends to have an anti-environmentalist, climate denialist perspective and could therefore jeopardize any transition at all? Could you also reflect on how this poses challenges for democracy more generally?
How long have you got?
That's the first part at least.
Yeah, I mean, well, let me focus on the sort of climate side of that. I mean, I think absolutely it's a key issue. The rise of sort of populist politics, or well, Hayley might want to talk about bullshit in a minute, because this is she's written about climate politics and bullshit, and the way that pervades climate politics. So she might want to come in on that. But yes, clearly, right-wing populism and its view of the state, its view of science, its view of global governance, all of those things push us in the opposite direction. This general distrust around taxation, many of the sort of key levers or institutions or approaches that you would want to push to address this issue are lightning rods for the extreme right. And we see this on all levels, obviously Trump and Bolsonaro and many others, or Johnson in this context, but I see it even locally when there's been proposals for pedestrianisation or phasing out car use in the centre of Brighton. You see it on Facebook and other media, this immediate reaction about this is the nanny state, this is the Greens gone mad, I have a right to drive my car ever. You get this quite strong libertarian reaction sometimes about any sense of restraint or the greater good. So even when you push back and say, well, your right to drive your SUV and park it wherever you want runs up against the rights of my kids to breathe clean air. What do we do about that? So it's really, really hard, and I don't know how you push back against it, because clearly we've tried coming back again and again on the science, and that doesn't fly with those sorts of audiences. Sometimes I think with right-wing groups and agendas, coming back to things like family and community plays a bit more, sometimes has a bit more resonance. So it can be about resilient neighbourhoods, strengthening. It can be about strengthening local forms of governance and so on. They see that in their view, that's a sort of anti-statist move. It's about taking control, good old taking back control, the Brexit phrase. In my view, that's about energy democracy and strengthening local participation. So I think sometimes there are strategic ways in which you can sort of raise these issues with those types of audiences. And then there I'm talking about a more local context. Or I've been involved in fossil fuel divestment movements here locally. And really you just have to argue always on the economics of this. Like, you may not buy the moral argument we're making here. You may not give a damn about the climate science, but these are just toxic investments that you're investing in. You're being utterly irresponsible as someone who fancies themselves being fiscally secure and economically responsible, and then they do react. Then you do get a bit of a reaction. So I think you have to be very careful in the registers you use in trying to deal with some of those characters. Many of them, of course, have no interest whatsoever in this agenda. So it's not actually about persuasion. It's really about delimiting their power. And I say something about this in the book. It's more Hayley's area than mine, but in other work with Abigail, we talked about how you actually consciously need to rebalance politics and institutions. So it might be around democratizing climate governance, sort of stuff that Hayley's written about, but it might be about bringing greater representation for future generations, lowering the voting age, dealing with contributions to political parties. I'm serious, there's a whole range of governance innovations that may be necessary to undo incumbency. Yeah. Because otherwise these characters just veto some of the more progressive measures that are coming through, in ways which have massive impacts on all of us, within our own societies and globally.
Yeah, I think Haley has a good piece of this issue around the question of deliberative collective agency, because so many libertarians just experience collectivity as the absence of their agency. Also, you have a big piece of this with workplace transition justice, because a lot of people are reacting against that. And Chris has a big piece, but I think with protest and uprising. I'm going to read the next three questions simply in the interest of time, and not because any of them deserve less time than the last ones, because these are all really interesting. So here's one from Julie MacArthur, another fan of Haley's Weber quote. Thanks so much to all three of you for your comments. Love that Weber quote too. Thanks, Haley. I'm so looking forward to reading the book. Peter is currently being shipped. I'm really curious about the building of diverse anti-capitalist alliances, ones that are gender diverse, anti or decolonial, and inclusive. Where do you see this happening? And do you see any particular institutional innovations that are more or less likely to facilitate this? Okay, that's the first of these. The next one comes from Pauline Destry. How do you reconcile the need for global decarbonization and an end to fossil fuels with carbon inequality and the right to develop resources, including new oil and gas discoveries, in historically low carbon emitters? Another really hard question. And then Isaac Stoddard is the third question. Thanks, Peter. Looking forward to reading the book. Any further thoughts on the role, limits, and risk of A, direct critique, including of incumbent and vested interests, vis-a-vis more subversive and reconfiguring approaches? These are massive, crucial questions. B, but that's only the first part. B, limits focused narratives, e.g. carbon budgets, planetary boundaries, and C, crisis-based narratives.
Okay, wish me luck. Those are big questions. Well, maybe I can start with the last one, Isaac's thing about questions around limits, crisis-based narratives. I mean, I do engage with that in the book, that question, and Heidi alluded to it as well, around equity and urgency, because sometimes the need for speed and the need to act quickly can be a vehicle for incumbents to impose solutions in fairly undemocratic and regressive ways. So you can say, because we've only got 9-10 years left to deal with this seriously, we need to go for a massive expansion of nuclear, or we need to go for geoengineering, or you get, as happened in the UK, the national government overriding local council objections to fracking, saying that this is a low carbon energy source, which is what happened in Lancashire. So you have the local council saying, okay, we're going to oppose fracking. And you have the national government overriding that, saying we need this as a low carbon fuel. So that sense of urgency or climate emergency can, in the wrong hands, lead to some of those sorts of regressive solutions. But I don't think that's inevitable. That's down to all of us to sort of make our voices heard and reclaim those spaces to try and argue for different solutions. And that partly touches on Julie's question, I think, a little bit about the spaces for some of those alternatives and for new alliances. And I do think citizens' assemblies, climate assemblies, some of these more bottom-up spaces where people start to engage and make their voices heard and challenge some of the sort of more dominant framings, I think are really important. But clearly it needs to go beyond the formal spaces. And so, I do have some sympathy with what Andreas Malm is arguing on, many others who place a lot more faith in blockadia or movements of one sort or another. To be honest, at this stage of the situation, we need everything. The idea that it's only going to be resistance, or it's only going to be legal activism, or it's only going to be bottom-up citizens' approaches annoys me, frankly, because you get that sort of intra-activist struggles over which is the way, the best way, the solution. Clearly, we need a whole range of all of these strategies, because what works in China isn't going to work in Denmark, what works in the UK won't work in the US. Proposals for taxation are much harder to push forward in the US, but there is some scope to do that in Scandinavia. You've got a strong state in China that may be willing to intervene in some ways that might not be possible elsewhere. So we really need all of these strategies tailored to the sort of political landscape in particular context. For me, it's really not the moment to be my strategy is better than yours moment. We absolutely need to throw everything at this. And of course, you know, I talk a little bit in the book about ecosystems of transformation. You know, these things, hopefully, if they work well, reinforce one another, okay? So, you know, you have the resistance, the blockade here to put in new pipelines or fossil fuel projects. But this in turn leads to activism around regulation. Why don't we stop these things coming to fruition in the first place? And activism around the finance side of it, saying whether it's, as has happened, you know, pressure on European Investment Bank or about fossil fuel divestment, cutting the lifeblood of financing for some of these projects. So all of these things start to have ripple effects and build on one another if it works well. So I think we need, you know, multiple theories of change in all of this. So that partly touches on Julie's thing, but I think in building those alliances, you know, and Chris's comments alluded to this, because I talked about the need to sort of link with indigenous and human rights and other groups. That's not an easy thing to do. We've tried to do it around, you know, fighting off trade liberalisation agreements or other things in the past. It always brings tensions. There's very different social movement cultures. There's always hierarchies between North and South or around class, gender and other lines. All of that needs to be navigated and is being, you know, like I'm quite involved in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty discussions, and there's indigenous peoples groups part of that. There's cities, there's human rights groups. There's a whole range of different groups that are coming at this. The key thing is, amid all those differences, is there enough common grounds to stand behind certain proposals and strategies? That's the key thing. What was the other thing? So Pauline's question around, yeah, fossil fuels in the global south, squaring the sort of equity side of it. I mean, again, a little bit talking about those alliances, you often hear the argument that we need to extract more fossil fuels in certain poorer countries. And that's probably true in terms of, in global terms, there's a level of lock-in or entitlement to carbon budgets in certain poorer parts of the countries, part of the world. But for that to be accommodated, it means more radical reductions in the global north, right? So there is a right to development. There is a right to extract fossil fuels for certain, you know, countries in the global south. But for us to live within carbon budgets, that means us in richer parts of the world reducing more rapidly. But I would also argue that many of the claims about the benefits that flow from that extraction are often disingenuous, right? We all know from resource curses, we know about where the revenues from that extraction go. We know about the localized health and environmental impacts. So when I hear Shell and BP proclaiming that they're the key actors in tackling energy poverty, you know, forgive me if I'm sort of lacking in too much belief and confidence in their ability to do that. And don't ask me, ask the people on the ground whose livelihoods have been destroyed often by those sorts of projects, particularly when there are so many other viable alternatives, you know. And so, of course, there's always going to be an argument about which reserves have to stay in the ground. And that's why I do think we need a multilateral agreement that tries to deal with some of those issues.
Yeah, you know, I come from a country that pays farmers not to grow crops. So it seems like we could pay oil producers not to extract, you know, we could work that out, that piece of it, for, you know, a certain kind of economic justice. We have two final questions, which I'm going to read in sequence, and you're welcome to deal with them as you can. The one is about the limits of Marxism, and the other is about the food dimension, food supplies. First, from Gareth Edwards: do we need in political economy analysis to get beyond Marxian frameworks if we really want a just and sustainable climate settlement? It feels Marxian analyses have been consistently strong in diagnosing the justice problem, but very poor in general at clearly theorizing what a more just outcome looks like and how we might get there. And then a question from Luisa Carvalho: watching the talk, I was wondering how you imagine the future of food supplies, more specifically thinking about the model of production and development that has been the driver for growth in Brazil, soybean production and exports to the EU and China. Production areas have only grown lately. Maybe that's why I thought of farmers. Thank you, Luisa.
Okay, so Gareth's question, a good one around Marxism. And I think, yeah, I do end up saying that in the book, essentially, that in terms of critique and an understanding of capitalism, I think, you know, resources from different strands of Marxism are invaluable. In terms of what would an alternative look like. I think there are some weaknesses for sure, and I frame it, as I sort of alluded to in my short presentation, as a thing about industrialism. So if it's about a centralized growth model, whether it's in public or private hands, is important, but from an environmental point of view, it's irrelevant to some extent. So if you had mass nationalization of all energy systems, but it was still within a productivist, growth-oriented mindset and way of organizing things, that would be equally problematic. It's not as if socialist experiments in the past have been non-extractivist. So I definitely move beyond, in terms of the alternatives and building a different energy economy. I definitely move well beyond Marxist traditions, and if anything, it's more ecological and green. And I bring in the political ecology work to try and make sense of that. So it does require for me, a bolder and more imaginative way of re-envisaging economies than sort of classic state socialist solutions, for sure. But in terms of the critique of the ways in which things are organised and trying to understand the different dimensions of state power and the relationship between state and capital and militarism, bringing that element in, I do find those sort of theoretical resources still very, very valuable and often underused. So the question about food, food comes up all the time in these sorts of debates, and it's a classic. Talking of Gramsci again, I wrote something a while ago with a colleague of mine, Olivia Taylor, on climate smart agriculture, because this, again, you get this legitimation crisis for the food system, as in rising emissions from the production of food and vulnerability in terms of adaptation, how we're going to adapt crops and current food systems to the effects of climate change. And the fertilizer industry and Monsanto, many of the key actors, have been at the forefront of defining what they call climate smart agriculture, which of course is very heavy on new technological solutions and market innovations, and very light on how to reduce inputs in the first place, and excludes most questions around land redistribution, avoiding food waste, restructuring food systems. But interestingly, I think that's one of the things, coming back to one of Christy's comments earlier, the COVID moment and the role of crisis, that has, at least in this part of the world, forced some rethinking about the sustainability of food systems. When you have those mass disruptions, there tends to be a need to look local and source more locally and produce things in different ways. So yeah, clearly the way the agri-food system is organised at the moment is part of the problem. So climate is just one other reason, but it's certainly not the only reason. You could certainly also talk about soil depletion, water problems. There's a whole range of reasons why the food system is not fit for purpose at the moment. And many of the problems are the same. It's a sort of productivist paradigm. It's an often disconnect between needs and how the system is currently organised within and beyond society. So yeah, food is absolutely a key side of this problem. And of course, then there's the food energy overlap around biofuels and things like that, where you try and resolve an energy crisis by going for biofuels and in turn create a food and a land crisis.
I'm really sorry to say that we are out of time. There are additional questions that I would invite Peter, you to think about an answer offline. There's Lee Towers elaborates on his earlier comment by talking about the role of debt collectives and mortgage strikes and various forms of striking through debt that might be effective here. Mark Hudson asks a good question about the rights culture war as an effective way of dealing with a lot of things, but very much also climate action and pushing it back in the US and also Australia. And Stefan Anderson asks, brings up a deep point about politics and behavioral shifts in the book. Is there more work that you could have done there or can do in your future work about how to produce those around climate issues? So I'm just gonna leave those with you to think about in the future, and thank you, Peter, very much for this work. The book is Power Shift. It's about power literally shifting, but also political power shifting. Thank you, Chris and Haley, for your contributions. And I also want to thank the audience for a set of really excellent questions.
Thank you for joining us. For ISRF updates and information about future events, please sign up to our mailing list at www.isrf.org/mailing list. See you again soon. Goodbye.